That hair is a disgrace to this uniform. Sergeant, a flagrant violation of AR 670 to 1. You will report to the barber at 1,400 hours and have it all shaved off. Every last strand. Is that understood? The crowd of soldiers, assembled for the morning's formation on the dusty expanse of Fort Greystone's main parade ground, snickered. A few coughed to hide their laughter, a ripple of shared contempt that validated the colonel's authority. The woman at whom the order was directed, Sergeant Eva Rostova, stood perfectly still, her spine a steel rod, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the shimmering heat haze rising from the distant mountains. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She did not even blink. Her face, a mask of professional calm, betrayed nothing of the insult's sting. Her hair, a thick, dark braid that fell to the small of her back, was the only thing about her that seemed out of place, a single point of nonconformity in a sea of regulated uniformity. It was the sole reason Colonel Marcus Thorne had singled her out, his voice a bullhorn of performative discipline. He was a man who confused volume with authority, a man whose own career had plateaued, leaving him to rule his small fiefdom with an iron fist of petty regulations. He saw her hair not as a simple breach of code, but as a personal challenge to his command, a symbol of defiance that needed to be publicly crushed. But when the general, who was observing the base inspection from the shaded portico of the command building, saw her stance, he didn't see defiance. He saw something else entirely. He saw a familiar stillness, a type of calm forged only in the crucible of unimaginable pressure, a posture he hadn't seen in over a decade. He leaned forward in his chair, a flicker of forgotten memory stirring in the back of his mind, a ghost from a past he thought was buried and classified. The sergeant's silence was her answer, a void more profound than any shouted protest. She simply offered a crisp, textbook salute, her movements economical and precise. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice even and low, devoid of emotion. It was this unnerving composure, this absolute refusal to be diminished, that infuriated the colonel most of all. He saw, as arrogance, a silent mockery of his power. He couldn't know that her silence wasn't a weapon against him, but a shield for herself, a discipline honed in places where a single misplaced word could cost lives. He couldn't know that the very regulation he quoted with such glee had exceptions for those on long-term clandestine assignments, exceptions for operators returning from deep cover where blending in was paramount to survival. He saw only a disobedient subordinate. He was about to make the most monumental mistake of his career. The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, the initial amusement curdling into a kind of morbid anticipation. They were witnesses to a public shearing, a ritual of humiliation designed to reinforce the hierarchy. They saw a woman being put in her place. The general saw a professional being tested, and he watched, his breath held, to see if the steel he remembered had lost its temper. If you believe true strength is found in silence, not shouting, type respect below. The walk to the base barber shop was a gauntlet of whispers and stares. Sergeant Rostova moved through it as if she were walking through mist, her focus internal, her presence contained. The barber, a nervous private who looked barely out of basic training, hesitated when she sat in the chair, the long, dark braid looking like a living thing against the stark white of the cape. "All of it, son," she said, her voice gentle but firm, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. Colonel's orders, the hum of the electric clippers filled the small shop, a mournful, metallic drone. The first pass of the blades was a shock, severing the thick braid at its base. It fell to the floor with a soft thud, a sacrifice to a false god of conformity. The private worked quickly, his hands shaking slightly, as swaths of dark hair fell away, revealing the pale, unblemished skin of her scalp. With each pass, her features became sharper, more defined. The high cheekbones, the steady, clear eyes, the resolute set of her jaw. The hair had been a veil, a softening element that allowed her to seem less conspicuous. Without it, she was a study in star geometry, her face a landscape of purpose. The other soldiers waiting for a trim watched in a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. They saw the end of a punishment. They couldn't comprehend that they were witnessing a rebirth, a stripping away of a disguise that she no longer needed. She paid the private, left the shorn braid lying on the floor, and walked out into the unforgiving sun, her newly bare head held high. She felt the heat on her scalp, a strange and intimate sensation. She felt the eyes of everyone she passed. But most of all, she felt a familiar lightness, the shedding of a role she had played for 3 years in the shadows. She was no longer undercover. She was exposed, and in that exposure, a dangerous kind of freedom was beginning to stir. The colonel saw her later that afternoon, her head gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the Tactical Operations Center. He gave a curt, satisfied nod, the matter closed in his mind. He had asserted his dominance, enforced the rules, and made an example of her. He had won. He returned his attention to the large screens dominating the front wall, where the command's most critical joint training exercise in 5 years was about to enter its most vulnerable phase. The simulation, codenamed Operation Chimera's Shield, involved coordinating air, sea, and land asset from 6 different allied nations against a sophisticated cyber and kinetic attack. It was the kind of complex, high-stakes war game that made or broke careers. And Colonel Thorne's career, he knew, desperately needed the making. He was so focused on the grand strategy, on the movement of digital brigades and phantom fighter wings, that he failed to notice the small, amber warning light that had begun to blink almost imperceptibly in the corner of the primary network status board. It was a quiet warning, a subtle sign of a gathering storm. And like the quiet sergeant he had just humiliated, he dismissed it as utterly insignificant. The amber light blinked for precisely 90 seconds before it turned solid, blood red. A single, piercing alarm cut through the low hum of the Tactical Operations Center, a sound that signaled not a simulated failure, but a genuine, catastrophic system collapse. The main screen, which had moments before displayed the intricate dance of a multinational force, dissolved into a cascade of corrupted data, a waterfall of meaningless symbols and error codes. Panic, cold and sharp, erupted in the room. Technicians shouted jargon-laced reports that all amounted to the same thing. They were blind. The entire network, the digital backbone of the most expensive and complex military simulation ever conceived, had been completely and irrevocably compromised. "What is it?" Colonel Thorne roared, his face a mask of disbelief. "Report." A young captain, the lead network engineer, turned from his console, his face pale. "Sir, it's not a hardware failure. It's a ghost. A parasitic code has rooted itself in the core kernel. It's rewriting our source protocols from the inside out. We're locked out. Completely." The colonel stared, his mind struggling to process the scale of the disaster. This wasn't just a glitch, it was a decapitation. The exercise was over. His career was over. The international observers, including the 4-star General Maddox, were witnessing the complete and utter failure of his command. "Get back online. Now," he bellowed, his voice tight with desperation. But his orders were useless, the equivalent of shouting at a hurricane. The technicians were typing furiously, their efforts futile. They were throwing pebbles against a fortress wall. The parasitic code was an elegant, terrifyingly efficient piece of work. It didn't just crash the system, it was disassembling it brick by digital brick and building something new and malevolent in its place. Amid the rising tide of chaos, Sergeant Eva Rostova, who had been quietly monitoring a secondary communications relay, stood up from her station. She moved with a preternatural calm, a small island of serenity in the swirling storm of panic. She walked past the shouting officers and frantic technicians, her footsteps silent on the raised flooring, and stopped behind the lead engineer. Her shaved head seemed to draw the light, making her a stark, unavoidable presence in the darkened room. She looked over the captain's shoulder at the stream of corrupted code flowing down the screen. "The encryption is recursive," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with the clarity of a scalpel. "It's using a nested quantum algorithm. You're trying to fight it on a single plane. It exists in 3" The captain looked up at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and confusion. "Who are you?" he snapped, his stress overriding his military courtesy. Colonel Thorne turned, his eyes narrowing. "Sergeant, return to your post. This is a command-level crisis." But Rostova didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the screen, her mind already mapping the architecture of the attack. She saw the patterns, the hidden symmetries, the ghost in the machine. It was a language she understood better than English. "Sir," she said, her gaze not leaving the screen, "with all due respect, you have about 3 minutes until the parasite code bridges the simulation firewall and infects the live base network. When that happens, our entire security, communication, and power grid will belong to whoever sent this." The colonel was about to order her forcibly removed when a new line of text appeared on the main screen, scrolling across the chaos in clean, white letters. "Chimera's shield is now Chimera's sword." Nice try. The anonymous attacker was taunting them. The room fell into a stunned, horrified silence. The game was over. The real threat had just begun. And in that deafening silence, Rostova reached past the stunned captain, her fingers hovering over his keyboard. "May I?" she asked, not of the captain, but of the code itself. It was a challenge. The captain was too shocked to respond, so he simply leaned back in his chair, surrendering the controls. Colonel Thorne started to shout another order, a desperate attempt to reclaim the crumbling edifice of his authority, but the words died in his throat. He, like everyone else in the room, was transfixed. Sergeant Rostova's hands descended upon the keyboard, and the atmosphere in the tactical operations center shifted. It was no longer a scene of panic, but of something else, something akin to witnessing a miracle. Her fingers didn't just type, they flew, a blur of controlled, fluid motion. It wasn't the frantic, percussive striking of the other technicians. It was a dance, a conversation. Her hands moved with a grace and certainty that was utterly mesmerizing. She didn't open new windows or run diagnostics. She dove directly into the raw code, the very heart of the system, and began to fight the ghost on its own terms. On the main screen, a new command line appeared, a single blinking cursor against the tide of corruption. And then, lines of code began to pour from it, written by her hands. It was a language no one in the room recognized. It wasn't C++, it wasn't Python, it wasn't anything taught at a military signal school. It was something older, more fundamental, a kind of digital Latin that spoke directly to the machine's soul. The parasitic code, which had been a raging, unstoppable torrent, seemed to hesitate. Its relentless advance slowed. The clean, elegant script Rostova was writing began to encircle it, to contain it, weaving a digital net of logic so complex and beautiful that it seemed more like art than programming. She was not deleting the virus. She was reasoning with it, cornering it, using its own recursive logic against itself in a breathtaking display of intellectual judo. The room was silent, save for the soft, rhythmic click of the keys. The shouting had stopped. The panic had subsided, replaced by a profound and growing sense of awe. The soldiers and officers stood frozen, watching a lone sergeant with a shaved head wage a war on a battlefield they couldn't comprehend, a war for the soul of the network. They had watched the colonel humiliate her for a single strand of hair, and now they were watching her single-handedly save the entire command from a technologically superior, unknown enemy. The irony was a physical weight in the room. Colonel Thorne stood rooted to the spot, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, disbelief, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying suspicion that he had made a catastrophic misjudgment. He had stripped her of her hair to enforce a rule, but in doing so, he had unwittingly stripped away her camouflage, revealing the apex predator beneath. The taunting message from the attacker vanished, replaced by a flurry of enraged, nonsensical code as the ghost realized it was trapped. Rostova's code tightened around it, constricting it, deconstructing it piece by piece, not with brute force, but with an unassailable, perfect logic. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The corrupted data vanished. The red warning lights blinked off. The main screen flickered once, twice, and then the familiar, orderly tactical display of Operation Chimera's shield reappeared, stable and secure. The system was clean. The network was theirs again. A collective, ragged breath was exhaled throughout the room. The crisis, which moments before had seemed insurmountable, had been averted. Sergeant Rostova's hand slowed, typed one final command, and then fell silent. She leaned back slightly, her work done. The entire engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes. In the deafening silence that followed her victory, a slow, deliberate clapping began from the back of the room. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, his face etched with an expression of profound, almost reverent respect, was General Maddox. He had seen the whole thing. General Maddox walked into the center of the room, his eyes never leaving the quiet sergeant. The slow, rhythmic clapping stopped, but the sound echoed in the sudden, tomb-like silence. The general's presence commanded an absolute, immediate authority that Colonel Thorne, for all his shouting, could never hope to achieve. He was a man whose reputation was built on decades of quiet competence, a leader who had seen real combat in places that didn't appear on maps. His gaze swept over the stunned faces of the technicians, lingered for a moment on the pale, sweating face of Colonel Thorne, and then settled, with an almost paternal warmth, on Rostova. She stood calmly by the console, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable. She had not acknowledged the applause or the stares. She simply stood, as if waiting for her next instruction. "Colonel Thorne," General Maddox said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. It was not a question, but a summons. Thorne snapped to attention, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and shame. "General, I believe you owe this soldier an explanation," Maddox continued, his voice as cold and hard as granite. "Not for her actions just now, which were, without question, the single most brilliant display of cyber warfare I have ever witnessed, but for her appearance." He gestured with his chin toward Rostova's shaved head. "What is the meaning of this?" Thorne stammered, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. "Sir, Sergeant Rostova was in violation of AR 670-1. Here, regulations. I administer corrective action, sir." The general stared at him, his expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. For a long moment, he said nothing, letting the colonel's pathetic excuse hang in the air like a foul odor. The other soldiers in the room held their breath, sensing that this was more than a dressing down. It was a reckoning. AR 670-1, Maddox repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. "You quote regulations to me, Colonel? You, who just presided over a security breach that nearly handed this entire installation's digital keys to an unknown enemy. You, who were saved from professional ruin by the very soldier you chose to publicly humiliate over a matter of grooming." He took a step closer to the colonel, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You are a fool, Thorne. A blind, arrogant fool." He then turned away from the trembling colonel and faced the room. "Let me tell you all who you have been serving with." He pointed a finger not at Rostova, but at a nearby communications officer. "Cadet, bring up the service record for Sergeant Eva Rostova. Security clearance. Omega level." The cadet fumbled with his terminal, his eyes wide. Omega level was a classification so high, most believed it was a myth, a boogeyman used to scare intelligence recruits. After a few tense moments of typing, the cadet's face went white. He looked from his screen to the general, then to the unassuming woman with the shaved head, his mouth agape. "Sir," the cadet whispered, his voice trembling. "Sir, I can't. It says her file is sealed." "Sealed by the Office of the Secretary of Defense." General Maddox smiled, a cold, grim expression. "Then allow me to unseal it." He walked over to the terminal, entered a 32-character alphanumeric code from memory, and pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner. The screen flickered, and a file opened. The file of a ghost. The contents of the file scrolled onto the main screen for everyone in the Tactical Operations Center to see, and a wave of collective shock rippled through the room. The document that appeared was Spartan, heavily redacted, yet what it did show was more than enough to paint a picture of a living legend. The name at the top was Eva Rostova, but below it was a list of code names. Oracle, Nix, creased below that, a service history that read like a piece of military fiction. Unit, Special Activities Division, Clandestine Operations Group 7. A unit so secret, its very existence was denied by the Pentagon. Her combat record was a string of blacked-out mission names in places like Syria, the Donbass region, and the South China Sea. But it was her list of qualifications that drew gasps. Master Cryptographer, Senior Network Exploitation Analyst, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, a Silver Star, and 3 Bronze Stars with V4 Valor. The last entry was the most stunning of all. Status: on detached special duty, returning from a 36-month deep cover assignment infiltrating the Volkov-Bratva's international cybercrime syndicate. The reason for her long hair, the reason for her quiet, unassuming demeanor, was suddenly, shockingly clear. It hadn't been an act of defiance. It had been a tool of survival, a piece of a carefully constructed identity that she had worn for 3 years in the darkest corners of the digital and physical underworld. The room was utterly silent. The soldiers and officers looked from the incredible list of achievements on the screen to the calm woman standing before them. They weren't just looking at a sergeant anymore. They were looking at a ghost, a hero pulled from the shadows into the harsh fluorescent light of their mundane world. Colonel Thorne looked as though he had been physically struck. The blood had drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. The regulation he had wielded like a club, R 670-1, had a specific addendum for clandestine operators returning from the field, a grace period to allow them to decompress and reintegrate. An addendum he had never bothered to read. He had not disciplined a soldier. He had desecrated a monument. General Maddox turned his gaze back to Rostova. His entire demeanor softened, the hard edge of his authority melting away to be replaced by a look of profound and genuine respect. He saw the shaved head, the symbol of her humiliation at the hands of a lesser man, and his face tightened with a quiet fury. "The code you used to dismantle that parasite," the general said, his voice now filled with a quiet awe. "I've seen it before. A long time ago. Project Daedalus, an experimental language designed to think, to adapt. They told me the project was shut down, that the lead programmer had gone dark. Rostova met his gaze for the first time, and a flicker of recognition, of shared history, passed between them. Daedalus was compromised, General," she said, her first unsolicited words since the crisis began. "I salvaged what I could. It evolves," the general nodded slowly, absorbing the immense implication of her words. She hadn't just used an old program. She had nurtured it, improved it, carried its legacy forward in secret. He then did something that no one in that room had ever seen a 4-star general do. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and executed a slow, perfect formal salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was the salute of a warrior to a warrior, an acknowledgement of immense skill, sacrifice, and honor that transcended rank. He was not saluting Sergeant Rostova. He was saluting Oracle. The general held the salute for a long, pregnant moment, his hand a rigid blade at his brow. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum where the normal hierarchy of military life had ceased to exist. In that moment, a 4-star general was paying homage to a sergeant, and every single person in that room understood the profound significance of the act. Respect wasn't about the rank on your collar. It was about the competence in your hands and the courage in your heart. After what felt like an eternity, Rostova returned the gesture, her own salute just as crisp, just as precise as his. The image was surreal. The revered, decorated general and the quiet, shorn-headed sergeant, locked in a moment of mutual, silent understanding. When the general finally lowered his hand, he turned to face the still frozen Colonel Thorne. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer angry. It was something far worse. It was weary and filled with a deep, institutional disappointment. "Colonel," he began, "you are relieved of your command of this exercise, effective immediately. You will report to my aide at 0600 tomorrow morning to discuss your future, or lack thereof, in my army. You have spent your career polishing the brass on the ship, while allowing the hull to rust. You mistook the symbols of authority for authority itself. You confused obedience with respect. And you took a giant, a genuine American hero who has bled for this country in secret, and you tried to break her spirit over a few inches of hair." He paused, letting the weight of his words crush the colonel's spirit. "You failed. Now get out of my sight." Colonel Thorne didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the Tactical Operations Center, a man hollowed out by his own arrogance. He was a ghost of a different kind, a specter of failed leadership. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room broke. A quiet murmur spread as people finally began to process the enormity of what they had just witnessed. They looked at Rostova with new eyes, with a mixture of fear, reverence, and shame for their own complicity in her earlier humiliation. The story of what happened in the TOC that day spread through Fort Greystone like a wildfire. It was told in hushed tones in the barracks late at night. It was whispered over meals in the chow hall. It became the stuff of instant legend. The story had all the elements of a modern myth. The arrogant king, the disguised hero, the public humiliation, and the stunning vindication. They called her the Oracle of Greystone. They called her Thorn's Folly, the shaved head. Once a mark of her punishment, became an emblem of honor, a symbol of quiet, undeniable competence. The young technicians who had witnessed her work spoke of her with a religious reverence, describing the way her fingers had moved over the keyboard, not as typing, but as a form of combat, a deadly martial art they had never known existed. Her legend became a powerful teaching tool, a cautionary tale for arrogant officers and an inspiration for every enlisted soldier who felt overlooked or underestimated. It was a reminder that true value wasn't always loud, decorated, or obvious. Sometimes it was quiet, sometimes it was hidden, and sometimes you had to strip everything away to see what was truly there. The day after the incident, Colonel Thorn was gone. He wasn't seen on the base again. Rumors circulated that he had been reassigned to a desolate weather station in Alaska, a classic military punishment designed to bury a career in ice and obscurity. His fall was as swift and total as Rostova's vindication had been absolute. His name became a byword for the kind of superficial leadership that the Army was desperately trying to purge from its ranks. In his place, General Maddox appointed a new commander for the exercise, a younger, more thoughtful officer who had watched the entire event unfold from the back of the room. Her first act was to call a full battalion formation. Sergeant Rostova stood in the ranks, her shaved head gleaming in the morning sun, indistinguishable from the other soldiers, just as she preferred. But this time, the stares she received were not of mockery or pity, but of profound, unadulterated respect. The new commander, a lieutenant colonel named Anya Sharma, stood before them. Yesterday, she began, her voice clear and strong, we were reminded of a vital lesson. A lesson about assumptions. A lesson about respect. We were reminded that the measure of a soldier is not the length of their hair or the shine on their boots, but the content of their character and the quality of their skill. She looked directly at Rostova. We are fortunate to have heroes among us. Most of them, we will never know. They serve in the shadows, they sacrifice in silence, and they ask for nothing in return. Yesterday, we were given a brief glimpse of one such hero. She then addressed Rostova directly. Sergeant Rostova, your actions saved this command from a catastrophic failure. Your competence under pressure was an example to us all. On behalf of every soldier standing here, I want to offer you our deepest gratitude and our most sincere apology for the profound lack of judgment you were shown. A spontaneous applause broke out among the ranks, a rolling thunder of respect that washed over the parade ground. Rostova, for her part, simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She sought no apology, required no praise. Her validation came not from the words of others, but from the successful completion of a mission. In the weeks that followed, a subtle but powerful change took hold on the base. The culture began to shift. Officers started listening more to their NCOs. The focus moved from superficial inspections to meaningful, skills-based training. The story of the sergeant and the shears had done more to reform the command's culture than 100 leadership seminars ever could. Rostova, true to her nature, deflected the attention. She took on the role of a mentor to the younger signals intelligence analysts, spending hours in the comm center, not just teaching them code, but teaching them a philosophy. Don't tell them how good you are, she would say, her voice low. Show them. Competence is the only currency that matters. Everything else is just noise. Her shaved head began to grow back, a soft fuzz that softened her sharp features. but the legend was already set in stone. She had become a living part of the base's folklore. A few months later, a small, unassuming plaque appeared on the wall of the Tactical Operations Center, right next to the main network console where she had worker magic. It didn't bear her name. It simply read, "The Oracle's Perch. Let silence speak. Let competence reign." October 12th, General Maddox had it installed personally. It was a quiet, permanent tribute to the quiet professional who had reminded them all what true strength looked like. The plaque became a touchstone for the technicians who worked there, a reminder of the standard they were all expected to meet. Before any major operation, it became a tradition for the lead engineer to walk over and place a hand on the cool metal, a small, silent ritual to invoke the spirit of calm, focused excellence that Rostova had embodied. Sergeant Rostova herself was not there to see it. Her work at Fort Greystone was done. One morning, she was simply gone, her bunk stripped, her locker empty. There was no fanfare, no farewell ceremony. Like the ghost she was, she had slipped away in the night, recalled to the shadows to fight the wars no one ever saw. But she left a powerful legacy in her wake. The young captain whose keyboard she had commandeered went on to become one of the top cyber warfare officers in the Army, forever changed by the 4 minutes he had spent watching a master at work. He built a new training module for incoming analysts based on the principles he had learned from her, a program he called the Oracle Protocol, which prioritized creative, adaptive problem-solving over rigid, by-the-book procedures. The story of her vindication became an official part of the base's orientation for new officers, a mandatory lesson in leadership delivered by Lieutenant Colonel Sharma herself. She would stand before the fresh-faced lieutenants and tell them the story of Colonel Thorne's folly, ending with the same powerful warning every time. Judge your soldiers by the content of their skills, not the conformity of their appearance. The person you underestimate today might be the only one who can save you tomorrow. The tale traveled beyond the gates of Fort Greystone, passed from soldier to soldier, from base to base, until it became one of the Army's enduring modern legends. It was a story about more than just a haircut. It was a story about the profound, unassailable power of demonstrated competence. It was a story that championed the quiet professional, the silent warrior, the individual whose worth is proven not by the volume of their voice, but by the precision of their actions. It was a testament to the idea that respect is not a right of rank to be demanded, but a privilege of skill to be earned. And in the silent, coded battles being fought every day in the digital ether, the legend of Oracle lived on, a whisper of a woman who could tame ghosts with nothing but logic and will. Years passed. Fort Greystone became a center of excellence for Cyber Command, its reputation built on the foundations of the cultural shift that began on that fateful day. The name Colonel Thorne was long forgotten, a footnote in a dusty archive. But the name Oracle was whispered with reverence. The story was now told to new recruits, not as a recent event, but as a foundational myth of their institution, like a story of Spartans at Thermopylae. It was the tale of how the command had learned to value substance over style, to seek out and empower the quiet professionals who formed the true backbone of the military. A new generation of soldiers worked at the Oracle's Perch, men and women of all backgrounds, judged not by how they looked, but by what they could do. The lesson had been encoded into the base's DNA. True legacy isn't what you say or what you demand. It's what you build, what you prove, and the standards you inspire in others. Eva Rostova was never seen at Fort Greystone again. Her name remained sealed in the nation's most secret files. But her actions created a ripple effect of positive change that continued to spread long after she was gone. She had proven that one person, armed with quiet competence and unwavering calm, could dismantle a flawed system of prejudice as effectively as she could dismantle a parasitic piece of code. She had shown them that a shaved head, intended as a mark of shame, could become a crown of honor. Her silence had spoken louder than any of Colonel Thorne's shouted orders ever could, a lasting testament to the simple, powerful truth that what you are is always more important than what you appear to be. The world is full of loud voices demanding respect they haven't earned. It is the quiet, competent hands that truly shape the future, that solve the impossible problems, that save us when everything seems lost. The story of Sergeant Rostova is a reminder to look past the surface, to challenge our own assumptions, and to recognize the hero who might be standing right in front of us, waiting silently for the moment to act. It is a call to be the person whose work speaks for itself, whose value is self-evident, and whose legacy is not written in medals or headlines, but in the quiet, continued success of the missions they made possible and the people they inspired. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.